1 meeting of the Board of Directors of the Ann Arbor Area Transportation Authority. A quorum is present and we'll get started. Just hearing some feedback. That's all right. First item is to approve the agenda. Can I have somebody move that into the record?
So moved.
So move Rich, seconded by Jesse. We'll go around and just approve the agenda. I'll just go by the people on my screen here. Yes or no, Mike?
Yes.
Jesse?
Yes.
Raymond?
Yes.
Rich?
Yes.
Kathleen?
Yes.
Kyra?
Yes.
Roger?
Yes.
Okay, and we have a unanimous, and I'm also a yes, so that's unanimous. Second item is the public comment, section 1.2. If anybody wants to address the board this evening, you have up to 3 minutes. Please state your name for the record. You can hit the raise hand icon on the bottom of the screen, or I think it's *9 if you're on the phone. So I'll look to Mr. Book to see if we have anybody who wants to address the board this evening.
Thank you, Chairman Mahler. Yes, we have Robert Bilowski. Mr. Bilowski, you've been unmuted.
Good evening. Can you guys hear me well?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. First thing I'd like to start off with is, so back in March, we had those public workshops for the reinstatement of service for August. We're getting close to that. We're getting close to June. And I would just like to know when you guys will get those public dates and the workshops posted on the AATA website before June. I'm just wondering when you guys can get those posted or get those posted early, so people have a notice out there when these meetings are supposed to take place in June. That's the first thing. And the second thing is, I was gonna mention this at the last board meeting, but it didn't come to mind at the time, but I'd like to give a big thank you for getting TheRide back up and running. It's a jump start. We're getting closer and closer to the ending of hopefully the pandemic, but who knows, but time will tell. But you know, we're getting better in this system. We're growing, you know, more than what we were doing in the pandemic, and TheRide is the jump start. And I really do appreciate you guys for getting that back up and running. And I'm looking forward to D2A2 getting back up and running too, very much. But other than that, I really would like to see, hopefully you guys can get those dates up for the workshop soon, so people have a notice out there and they'll be ready for them when it gets to that point. But anyway, those are my questions and comments tonight. Hope you guys have a great weekend and a great week as well. It's supposed to be a hot weekend this weekend, but hope you guys stay hydrated and safe as well. Take care now.
Thank you. Keith, do we have anybody else who wants to address the board?
Yes, we do. We have Mr. Jim Mogensen. Mr. Mogensen, you've been unmuted.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So I wanted to make a comment about what has been called the Gold Ride, and as things had been changed around, it got murkier and murkier. So I'm going to call it the Senior Cab Ride. So how did this happen, and how was it that it was only in Ann Arbor? Well, Chris White was attending a meeting of the City of Ann Arbor Community Development Group, and some senior advocates were trying to figure out and had done some, strategic planning about saying, well, we need to find a way to have senior citizens have extra ways to get around. And before you knew it, it got incorporated into the ride's service, and it was initially essentially a fare subsidy for taxis. And so that's how it worked out. And in fact, it was in Ann Arbor, and in fact, when the U of M put its senior center out at the East Ann Arbor Medical Center, when people went over the bridge on 23, it all of a sudden went full fare. And you could do that because it was taxis, and it was just the fare subsidy that changed. So, so what happened is then all of this murkiness came in, and the reason it was Ann Arbor is because, remember, we have the 1973 transit millage, and now we have the overlay, and those other Ypsilanti and Ypsilanti townships only have the overlay, which is only 0.7 mils, right? And the I forget exactly what the official one for Ann Arbor is, but it's over 2, or it was at some point. It was 2.5 originally. And so there was more money in Ann Arbor, and this was a special service for people in Ann Arbor because there was more money, property tax money for transit collected than was needed to run the fixed bus service. And so that's how we got that service. And so now you're trying to figure that out. So it's important, I think, as you come through this conversation, to make sure you're asking the right questions, because you could have a situation if you tighten up paratransit, some of those seniors will not qualify. If you have to use a sedan, you wouldn't qualify. And so you could have a stranding where people who should not be driving was essentially what that was for, and needed help driving. So thank you very much for your time and attention. And I'll have another comment at the end of the meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Keith, anybody else?
We do not have anyone else.
Okay. Thank you. We'll close the public comment period, move on to general announcements, section 1.3. Does anybody from the board or the staff have any general announcements to make this evening? Not seeing any, then we'll close that and move on to the consent agenda. We have minutes from the last board meeting and then the committee meeting reports in our packet. Can I have somebody move the consent agenda to the record?
So moved.
Rich, seconded by
Second.
Kyra. And we'll go through the list again. Yes or no for the consent agenda. Mike,
Yes.
Jesse,
Yes.
Raymond,
I'd like to abstain on this one. I wasn't clear.
I think that was an extension because you were not here, although it was a little garbled, so got it. Rich,
Yes.
Kathleen,
Yes.
Roger,
Yes.
Kyra,
Yes.
and I'm also a yes, so that's unanimous. Thank you. I think we're still getting some feedback from somewhere. Okay. Then we'll move on to section 3, which is the policy monitoring and development report, the committee discussion. Any discussion on the committee reports that were in the packet this evening, or the minutes? Okay. If not, we'll move on to 3.2, the Ownership Linkage Task Force. And that will be covered by Mr. Alamein, starting on page 30 of our packet. I'll turn it over to him. Mike?
Okay, thank you. We discussed briefly last month that we reconstituted the task force for ownership linkage, and we're hoping to have a dialogue on it, but that didn't happen. And I think the problem was it's been a while since we've talked about ownership linkage, the ownership linkage, other than the ownership linkage task force. And furthermore, a number of board members weren't around a couple of years ago when we did talk about ownership linkage. So we thought it would be a good idea to bring back the person who actually helped us very much in terms of developing and implementing ownership linkage. That's Rose Mercier. She works with a firm called Governance Coach, and I believe they are somewhere in Ontario. And of course, Rose has come back several times after the implementation to help us on various things. And I think probably most of the people on the board today have had some exposure to Rose. However, I don't see Rose up on the screen that she's ready to join us. So perhaps we should move on in the agenda.
We can
Hi,
come back.
this is Keith. I think that Matt is checking in with Rose now. She may be having some technical issues.
That's fine. We can move on and come back to this once we have Rose secured. So we'll move on then.
Matt just did a thumbs up.
I think he was thumbs upping to come back later to her.
Oh, okay.
So we'll move on to 3.3, the monitoring external relations policy. I was reminded, and I sorry for the inconvenience here, but we do need to do this per a very new law. And I forgot about this at the beginning of the agenda. All of the board members need to announce where they are calling in from. It's okay to do this remotely, so if that's okay, can we just go through and have everybody, to make sure we're compliant, everybody just announce where they're calling in from, where they're sitting right now. So you can just say the city, county, that's fine. Mike?
I'm in Ann Arbor. Of course, that's Washtenaw County.
Jesse?
I'm in Ypsilanti, Michigan.
Raymond?
Ann Arbor.
Rich?
Pittsfield Township, Washtenaw County.
Kathleen?
Ann Arbor, Washtenaw County.
Roger?
Onekama Township, Manistee, County, Michigan.
Kyra?
Ann Arbor, Washtenaw County.
And I'm also calling from Ann Arbor and Washtenaw County. So thank you for that. We'll move
And
on. then
Roger,
to
we're jealous. You look very comfortable.
he does.
Looking out over Lake Michigan here.
Rough life. So let's move on to 3.3, which is the external relations policy. That was in the packet, starting on page 35 is the monitoring report. Happy to go through, and I'll turn it over to, well, I'll go through it real quick. The monitoring report indicates that the staff's interpretation was compliant with all of the policies and sub-policies there. We did have a number of comments from board members about the difficulty deciphering, interpreting the applicability of some of these policies, which are indicated at the end of the report. Some of them couldn't be determined. Some people thought they were not in compliance. Some thought that the interpretation was a little too extreme in terms of the action to, in 293, one person said the dissolution is both too extreme and doesn't provide evidence for relationships. So I think I would like to, instead of reading all the comments here, does anybody care to comment in particular about anything regarding the report in general? Roger?
Yeah, we discussed this in the service committee, and several of the policies, I think particularly 2.9, 2.93, 2.94, found they're pretty subjective. Not only are they descriptive, but they're also pretty subjective, and it's very difficult to come up with objective evidence to show compliance. So the suggestion of the service committee was that just go back to the governance committee, and we perhaps engage Rose Mercier in trying to rewrite several of these policies so that they can be objectively verified.
Thank you. Anybody else who wants to weigh in on the comments or anything particular with the report or the policy? Jesse? Jesse, go ahead.
Sorry, I muted myself instead of unmuting. I have issues with the interpretation of 293 as referenced. As I've said there, one that I feel like the threshold of some public figure calling for the dissolution of the authority is not a reasonable interpretation of of that. I agree it's a flawed policy that requires development. However, I feel like if we are to be voting on it, we kind of have to vote on it as it's written and as it was presented to us. And as it is presented, I don't feel like it's in compliance with the spirit or the letter of that policy. So there's the threshold that the CEO puts forward is too extreme, and thus I do not feel is reasonable. It also doesn't cover anything other than he's only talking about elected officials, which doesn't include what's explicitly mentioned, community stakeholders in the policy. So if we as a board choose to vote on that policy, I would be recommending not in compliance on 2.293. 294, I had also, as we had a pretty lengthy discussion about this in the service committee meeting, and since then Matt added made the amended section, which is in red text on page 35 of our packet, and I think that's a very fair recollection of what happened. However, I feel that it in and of itself is evidence of not being fully in compliant with the policy. We did have this misstep. It's understandable why it happened. However, there's nothing like if our question is yes or no in compliance, then I would say we don't have an option that says, no, but there were extenuating circumstances. We have yes or is in compliance or was not in compliance.
Well, we could vote to say in compliance except for the items noted and not adopt the CEO's recommendation. So we could go for the next level down from that if we so choose. And
right,
we normally we can do that.
We normally interpret that as like each policy being in compliance. So I mean, I would, I don't know that we've ever broken it down to like the sub policy being in compliance except as noted. But if we can do that, then I would say, but I guess in terms of what the CEO reports degree of compliance is compliant, I would disagree with that. I say we have a very, we have evidence that for a lack of compliance, and I guess not knowing what the threshold is, like if one piece of evidence goes contrary to, if we have one misstep in an entire year, I guess
well,
the way
I think it's a matter of degree. So I mean, I think if you feel that it's significant enough a misstep or a miss on the compliance, you could, or any board member could recommend level C, which is making reasonable progress toward compliance, which is stops short of saying compliance or compliant, and it doesn't quite give the level of satisfaction of saying yes, we're in compliance except for a few straggly things here and there. So we could go with C, which is making reasonable progress toward compliance as well. So that's also an option, which stops short of saying compliant. D would be the kind of the not in compliance or not making reasonable progress toward compliance. So if you felt that we were severely off enough, you could suggest we adopt level D, not in compliance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think as far as the overall report goes, my feeling is that for the most part, the policy is in full compliance, but I do think there are these notable exceptions of 293 and 294.
Okay. All right, thank you. Anybody? Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, I think I pretty much agree with what Roger had to say, and I, of course, didn't have the benefit of his committee meeting. But going through these, many of them, I think, just can't be proved, can't be measured, can't be proved. And I could list off the ones that I think fall into that category: 2.91, 0.2, 0.3, 0.5, 0.6, 0.5. I think this whole 2.9 needs to be reviewed, and probably some of these just eliminated, and others, particularly if they can't be reworded so that they can really be measured and proved. it's a very difficult situation that I think needs to kind of go back to ground zero on.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else on the external relations report? Jesse, go ahead.
I just want to point out, Rose has joined us and has the hand raise button clicked. I'm not sure if she had something to chime in or if that's something that we wanted to listen to, since we are talking about the nature of policy.
Yeah, I was gonna ask her or Matt when he's done chowing down if he has anything to add to the discussion. So I was gonna defer to Matt. I can't see the raise hand button, but if Rose or Matt want to chime in with anything, feel free to go ahead. But I want to make sure the board members have a chance. If any other board members have anything to add first. Okay, Matt, go ahead.
Oh, I'll defer to Rose.
Okay, Rose, are you there?
I am here. I'm curiously blacked out, but that's okay. So my comment was just around in the monitoring the motion, you can in fact make an exception and say that the policy is you're finding compliance with the exception of this item, and or right, if you can, with the exception of this item, and the board either expects this to be rectified by the next time you monitor the policy, or you could specify a date, or you could say you accept the CEO's explanation for the situation of non-compliance. So you have some options. You don't need to just assess a policy as the full policy as being compliant. You can, make some exceptions, or not make exceptions. You can tailor your motion to suit the situation and what you find in the policy. And I'll just echo Mike's comment about the policy could use some looking at.
Okay, so I guess Jesse, go ahead.
Rose, I had a question. Does that mean that it would be okay to say is in compliance and is, except for items noted, and is making reasonable progress towards compliance on those noted items, like kind of making a combination of A, B, and C?
You could, if in fact that's the case. I think what I was hearing was that there was a situation of non-compliance that was an exception in the course of this year. So I wouldn't necessarily say that was moving towards compliance. I think I'd probably say with the exception of this item, but that the board accepts the CEO's explanation for the situation or the exceptional circumstances. You could say something like that.
But I think the point Jesse made was that, he doesn't, at least with 293, I think, doesn't agree with the CEO's interpretation. So it's not making reasonable progress toward it. If he disagrees with the overall, interpretation, therefore he shouldn't be in compliance.
And
so we could tailor the motion if we want to do that. I wouldn't recommend blending two or more at once. I mean, we could say in compliance except for items noted, and the board will, what it sounds like between what Roger said, Mike, Jesse, what others said in the write-up, it sounds as if there's some confusion about what should happen, or the language itself. Sounds like the governance committee should take a look at this and study it to see if we can clean this up a little bit, maybe with Rose's help after we have a chance to talk about it a little bit. But there's, it's on the floor right now to vote on this particular monitoring report as it is. And so we need somebody to kind of bring that to the floor in terms of some kind of, motion for us to make. So that's what we need to do now. And if somebody wants to say in compliance items noted, we'll revisit the policy and come back with changes at a later date, we could do that. Or making reasonable progress. I'll leave it to the board, somebody from the board, to move that forward. Roger?
Okay, well, paraphrase, I'll say, I would move that we be in compliance except for items noted, and those items would be examined by the governance committee with possible rewriting.
Okay. Do I have a second for that? Kathleen, seconded. Any more discussion on it? Jesse?
Just to clarify that the items noted being 293 and 294.
Correct.
Okay.
So we can vote for the, as moved by Roger, we can vote yes or no then. Mike,
Yes,
Jesse,
Yes.
Raymond,
Yes.
Rich,
Yes.
Kathleen,
Yes.
Roger,
Yes.
Kyra,
Yes.
and I'm also a yes. So that passes unanimously, all right. Thank you. Now, if we want to go back to ownership linkage, Mike, we do have Rose on the line here, so maybe we'll switch back to that. Go ahead.
okay, as I had said earlier, I think most of you already know Rose, and she's been very important to ATA in terms of when we decided to go to policy governance. She was the one who held our hands for a long period of time to get us clear about what policy governance was, and helped us write it, and then helped us implement it. And she's been a great asset for us. And today she is back to help us get back on track regarding an important part of policy governance that we haven't done much about yet. And that's something called ownership linkage. As I said earlier, Rose is a senior consultant with a firm called Governance Coach. And I believe they're located in Ontario someplace, are they not, Rose? So,
Well, our head office is actually in Calgary, Alberta, but I'm
Oh, in
located in
Alberta.
Ontario. Yeah.
okay. So, yes, Rose, please. We're eager to hear what wisdom you have to impart to us today.
Weird. Sorry, there I am.
There you
Okay,
are.
there I am. All right. Just very disconcerting to not see myself. Not that that's what I understand. Sorry about the extra sound accompaniment here. I had brought a few slides because what I understood was just to kind of reorient the thinking about ownership linkage. So I made just a couple slides. One was to talk about thinking about both the ride's kind of legal ownership, which in fact is the city councils and the town council. And then also kind of the moral ownership, which was the residents of the areas that are served. But and I think in the original discussion, what the original planning, if I'm correct, Mike, was that the thought was to try and have to make some linkage with the legal owners as a first step, right? But so what I've done is just to create a little, I'm going to share this in a second here because Keith said I could do that. Hang on, where are we? This is a challenge. The dog's other legal owner has not come home to look after him, so we are. So what I want to do is just to think about, that we did talk about kind of the legal owners being, as I've said, the city councils and township council, and that the moral ownership of having a, if you will, also having a moral accountability or a moral ownership of the residents. And sometimes that's useful to think about that, of knowing that you are going to talk with city councils or part of the councils or some or all or some of that. I'm really sorry about this. Another way to think about this is just to give it a bit of a different flavor, is that because the legal ownership are city and town, the city, I'm just throwing me off, the city and township councils, and that the moral ownership that you've identified also happen to be the electors of the legal owners. So it makes it kind of a bit, I think this just gives it a better picture of understanding that the people that you engage with as kind of a moral owners also have a relationship with the legal owners, and the legal owners have a relationship with those people as well as electors. So the thinking about how do you talk to essentially elected officials about kind of the ownership questions and try and move it away from being what's happening today and kind of, because the natural inclination when you if you will engage with ownership is that they maybe don't, well, they likely see themselves as owners, but the questions, right, the concerns end up being about services and what's operational and what's staff. And so one of the things to pay attention to is what are the questions you want to ask. And so in general, what you want to ask are big picture, future oriented questions. So something like either what people might see or what the councils might see as the most significant challenges to transit in the area in the next decade, right? So that you're kind of purposely keeping the focus on significant challenges and the next decade, or particular issues or needs that you think the RIDE needs to address. And once again, I'd probably be talking about over the next decade or in the next 5 years. Any priority needs that aren't currently being met will probably get you into a nearer term future. And then also maybe opportunities that you see in the community that could have an impact on transit, or opportunities that you see for transit to have an impact on the community. So it's kind of making sure that the questions you're asking engage with those individuals on that kind of bigger picture, longer term. Another way to kind of get at the owner's kind of values or perspectives or priorities is you could do some engagement with kind of the moral ownership, right? The residents, and use either focus groups or surveys, and then feed that back, right? So that you're engaging in conversations that we're saying is, based on the engagement that we've had. We've heard the following from residents and visitors about those things that will be important over the next decade, or issues and challenges that they see. What do you think about that? So that you've got some, if you will, data or another source of data to kind of engage the legal owners with. And the other thing that you can do is really to discern values and priorities from secondary data. So if the councils have been producing, policies or documents or decisions that have, if you were, are relevant to or are directly related to transit, then you could actually kind of infer from what's learned in that secondary input to kind of establish what's desired in the future. And then you could, once again, you could test that analysis with the legal owners so that you it gives you some different frames of reference. And so so that's kind of, it's pretty kind of simple. I can stop sharing now because I don't know that they're okay. Anyway, so that's just kind of a trying to position ownership linkage in terms of what you want to do, but also really encourage you to think about how do you make sure that the conversations that you have, if you start with the legal owners, really try and get them to think big picture and longer term, because it's pretty tempting, right, to get into, well, here's my experience today, or here's what the last 5 people who called me about the ride said. And so you want to kind of encourage that conversation to shift. So, and I'm open for questions or comments.
I'll turn it back over to Mike at this point, and maybe Mike, you can take us through how you want to focus the discussion at this point, if you want.
Okay, Rosa, another thing we've talked about, and we've actually had one round of meetings
Mhm.
with the legal owners. We started talking about ends and what
Mhm.
and how they really direct the or aspirational in terms of what we want the ATA to do or to have
Mhm.
influence on it in our really related to long-term goals.
Yep.
At the time we had these meetings, we were in the process of revising our ends, which we weren't happy with at the time.
Right.
Now, as you know, have, I think, a pretty good set of ends.
Yeah.
And I think that at least what I have in mind is being the focus of the next round of ownership linkage meetings with our legal owners is to first of all look at the ends. We
Mhm.
told them that we were going to share them with them, and
Yep.
we certainly want their comments on them.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
certainly what you just outlined is part of or ends are part of the framework you just talked about.
Yeah.
Really.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think that's it's a good, I think when you talk about ends, it's not what would you change in them? It's more about, if we made this happen, would you be satisfied with the progress or the accomplishments of transit? Does that fit what you see as the priorities in the, in your community from your perspective? And then you could easily segue into, what do you see as maybe the challenges in the next decade that we need to address? But you could, depending on timing, right? Depending on how the conversation goes, you might want to have something just that I would say is kind of it's like the back pocket question, which is, if everyone said, well, these look good, right? That's kind of a short meeting. So then you might want to say, okay, if that's kind of where the conversation goes to, what would we ask next?
And just for your information, the current ownership linkage task force includes Kyra Sims, includes Jesse Miller, and Rich Chang. And we've had 3 or 4 meetings now, I think.
Okay, great.
And perhaps you've seen some of the written output from those meetings. But I have to say, we run into a problem. We've had difficulty engaging the rest of the board. And maybe it's because we haven't done a good job of communicating it. Maybe it's just a difficult for people to get their arms around and thoughts around. But of course, we feel it's very important to get the involvement of the board. This isn't just one or 2 individuals going out and trying to talk to certain people. This should be, I'm sure you taught us, and we are believers that the entire board should be involved in this activity, and it's very important.
Well, can I jump in here actually?
Yeah.
So I think, because actually that's something I want to focus on. Because in the end, like you said, it is the individual board members that this is actually something we need to be involved in. Because historically, when we say we, most of the time it's actually Matt and the staff, right? Where we're not as involved, it's more oversight, a strategic viewpoint. Whereas this one is us actually hitting the pavement, getting in front, chatting with these different legal owners right now, and then potentially even the moral owners. And I'm fairly new to this board, and I really didn't understand what ownership linkage was until I was asked to actually join this committee, and then they had given me like this quick kind of dump of like, here's what it actually involves, because like those 2 words together were just odd for me to even wrap my head around. And so I think what it is now is it's really us as board members understanding that we have a responsibility to help be like almost a voice and a bridge between these legal and moral owners and even the staff, right? Especially as we move into various potential future initiatives around funding, that kind of stuff. And the analogy I like to liken it is, like, I'm involved in a lot of different nonprofit boards, but it's more impactful, or we seem to get more results when me as a business owner, I go to other business owners and say, like, hey, can you please help out with this initiative? Versus say the executive director or even some of the staff or this organization's asking the same question with the same words, the same intent. It's just, I think more, we might have an easier time getting buy-in or even having further discussions when it comes from us as board members versus a staff member being in that same seat.
Yeah. And it is actually in your posts, one of the jobs of the board is to link with the ownership, right? And so it's your job. You don't want to delegate it away. And I mean, I appreciate what Mike's saying around, it's hard to have everybody engaged. You don't have to necessarily have all of the board meeting with all of the, all of one council. You can have, others meeting. What you maybe are looking for, and I'm just guessing, is beyond just the committee doing the work. I mean, the committee's terms of reference really would set out to say is that the job of the committee is to support the board in its work in ownership linkage. So it isn't just, do all of the work in ownership linkage. You might sort out, here's kind of the plan for how we're going to do it. Here's the focus of the questions. Here's the kind of how we see this rolling out. Because it's not just a single event. It's going to roll out over time, and it's kind of an ongoing cycle. And so there's always some part of that. So it may be, how do you maybe have other board members engage with you? I guess it's just, thinking about how to share that work. But you also want some, I think, looking for, I'm going to guess, sort of feedback on the plan or feedback on the orientation of the questions. Thinking about, what's the reasonable way to, what's reasonable over the course of, this year and, maybe next year in terms of what we're able to do.
Go ahead, Jesse.
Jesse?
Thank you, Rose, for coming. I had a couple of questions, and I think they play well off of what you were just saying. I was wondering if a subset or a single person can represent multiple owners. So you talked about talking with council. Our governing bodies they consist of 25 people, which is a lot. And these people have lots of different opinions. They don't speak with a single voice. So I'm wondering how to manage that.
Well, I don't think you're asking them to speak with a single voice. Mm-hmm. You might hear from, I think any group of, they're not all going to, they're not 25, but whatever the councils are, there's probably different perspectives that exist within that. But so what you want to do in the course of linking with owners is to hear that sort of range of priorities and values, to kind of aggregate input as you gather it, and then to add to it, right, the wisdom of this board, right? So it's like we've heard a range of things in the three councils. We've heard kind of a real range of opinion, but here's some of the themes that are coming out of that. Here's maybe an outlier that we want to explore a bit more, but then add to it your own knowledge and experience and expertise, and maybe further education that says, okay, this helps us now shape, either to not tweak isn't quite the right word, but maybe massage a little bit the ends that we do have, but also that helps us in our thinking about what our ends down the road might look like, right? So you might revisit your ends in the next 3 or 4 years. They're probably not going to shift tremendously, right? But so it's you want to gather that, takes those insights, make sure you're keeping track of the insights that you've learned, right? And then so that when you come to rethinking your ends, reviewing your ends, redeveloping your ends, you have that data available to you. So that makes sense.
Yeah, I think so. The other question I had, and this might actually be more for staff or for the board, but as you were talking about the questions being like, what are our goals for the 10 years? We currently have a public advisor group that's been formed to guide staff in creation of our new long-range plan. Would and that's supposed to be, and that's, I think, to be made up of members of who we've identified as our moral owners, people from the community. It's specifically the member, you know, and what was written is like, it is supposed to represent the community. Would having, but you've also said that we can't really, or at least we shouldn't, delegate ownership linkage to staff. Would, I'm just
So-
in terms of identifying an opportunity, would it make sense for a board member to be sitting in on there as a form of ownership linkage, not as a member of that group, but as a way of listening? Would that be considered ownership linkage for a
I'm
board?
not- Yeah, I wouldn't look at that as ownership linkage. I think that's input into a strategic plan that really is a management tool, if you will, to achieve the ends, right? Or to achieve the ends reasonably interpreted, if you will. So I wouldn't confuse the two just because the input in the strategic plan, well, it's likely going to be, you know, strategic in nature, kind of, you know, long-term thinking. It's really going to be focused around, you know, how do we operationalize ends? What does this look like when they're accomplished? You know, what are the, if you will, what are the means? And it's really about how are we going to do this and when, and what are we going to do in order to accomplish what we've said are the results that we want to produce. So it's, does it help in gaining perspective? Yes. But is it ownership linkage? Yeah, I wouldn't characterize it as ownership linkage.
Thank you.
Kathleen?
So I'm really happy that all of this dialogue is taking place, because since I first joined the board and the idea of ownership linkage was quite exciting, I do agree with Mike that the task force should not be the be all end all, that all the board needs to be involved. However, what I'm thinking, or what my thought was that the task force was going to help sort of help give the board direction or opportunities or whatever to participate, because it doesn't, me as an individual board member wouldn't call up, say, Chris Taylor and say, hey, I want to have a meeting. I'm on the board of AATA. I want to link with you. You know what I mean? I would want to have purpose. I would want to have an understanding. And, you know, Mike said, of course, we would want to discuss ends, and these would need to be formal. So I was sort of looking to the task force as being the sort of point person, so to speak, to help guide the board and engage the board, so that so that maybe they're the ones who help maybe make the meetings or begin the dialogue, and then say to the board, look, we have a meeting coming up with Ypsilanti, or we have this meeting coming up with Chris Taylor, and we would like a variety of board members to attend. Who would like to be, and then the entire board could be involved. But I don't know how the entire board as an entity can engage with legal owners without some sort of focal point, you know, one sort of point person. And that's what I thought the task force was.
And Kathleen, I think you're interpreting that correctly.
Well, Mike, is this a good time to get into the 3-year linkage plan that's in the packet? I mean, to kind of, does that speak to Kathleen's concern right there? I mean, is this a good time to introduce that, or what do you want to say?
Perhaps. First of all, I'd like to ask the board, have everybody read this, and is there confusion about what's in it? It sounds.
Board members, feel free to speak up. I mean, I don't want silence to be either way. I mean,
I saw some shaking of heads, but I didn't hear any more.
I personally have read it, and I'd be happy to go through the details. But this is when I heard Kathleen's comment, and I'm looking at the draft plan in the packet that's in front of me. You know, how we divide up the work and apply this to get the whole board's engagement on it is what came to my mind. So if other board members have had a chance to look at it, have questions on it, or if Mike, you want to hold off on this or talk about something else, that's fine too. But if you want to go through the details of this, of which there's a fair amount of detail here. Either way, I'll leave it to you.
Okay, if people could look at the section that we had in the board package, which was in the board package last week. And I think it's page 31 of the packet that has a 3-year timeline at the top of it.
Yeah.
Can people get that in front of them? And here's what the task force concluded would be, in general, what we should be doing next. Let's just look at FY 2021. Discuss ownership linkage with the board. We've been doing that. We want to, there's a in our policy manual, there's policy 3.0, which actually addresses ownership, like who our owners are. And we feel that we need to look at that and revise it, probably revise it somewhat. So that's the first couple of items on there. But then what we're mainly talking about here is what do we do next with the board in terms of actual linkage. And we've had that first round of meetings, but we need to have a second round with the legal owners. I think everybody understands who the legal owners are, but we want to review with them, first of all, what ownership linkage is all about and what we're there for. And then as I said earlier, we wanted to focus on our ends policy, which really drives the organization more than anything else, at least in my opinion. And really get into a good dialogue with them about those ends, and for us to clarify them if there's any question, and to get their feedback on, what do they think about those particular ends? What kind of long range goals or objectives maybe that aren't there that the municipalities think should be? Are we leaving things out? Do they want to say anything about priorities? And then whatever, obviously we can't predict what exactly will happen in those meetings, but certainly based on that conversation, talk about what should be our next step in having this dialogue. And so that's what we see, let's say, going on in this current fiscal year. We and Matt too, because he has the most contact with these particular governing bodies, would set up meetings with them, give them information ahead of time, and then certainly we want to have a representative number of board members attend these meetings. The legal owner should know you're really talking to the board, and the board is talking to you. And as Rose was saying earlier, we really want to focus not on a bus stop here or something like that. That's really the staff's role. But we want to have a long-term perspective here. We want to have a big picture perspective here. And that's the kind of dialogue we want. There's might be some trouble in a mayor or somebody wanting to, because they're hearing from their constituents about specific operational issues, but that's not really the intent of ownership linkage, and get that across also. But we certainly do want the participation of all board members in these meetings. And then I don't know if now would be the time to go on to future kinds of meetings, but we have moral owners, as Rose talked about too, and reaching out to them is entirely different because they're very dispersed. There's very many of them, but they can be, for example, combined with surveys. For example, Matt is talking about doing one very, very soon. And again, but we want to focus both in terms of the legal owners and the moral owners, really on big picture, long-term focus. And I guess I'd like to just leave it at that for now and hear comments from the board about what they think about that, or have I said enough? Do you want to go into more detail? Do you want to look further next year and the year after about what we're going to be doing? Obviously, our ownership linkage and what folds or unfolds will be an ongoing process, and we'll be learning as we're going.
Yeah, I think, Mike, we'll have to get into a little bit of detail about this in terms of the division of labor and what the foci is that the plural of focus, whatever that is. So for instance, and here's what I mean, we could very well go out and have a lot of these discussions with the legal owners, and we could defer operational, larger strategic discussions to Matt and the staff. However, does it make sense, and I'm just kind of putting this out there for the board, does it make sense for the board to be directly involved in all of the transit-oriented development talk that the city is engaging in right now? And, that is a long-term, obviously very strategic, long-term, big picture ticket item that, Matt has been, and the staff have been, talking a lot to the city about. Should we be involved in those discussions? Same thing with the RTA or the regional planning of transit in the area. Obviously, that's something that many board members have been involved with in the past. And should we take a more active role in that? Matt's done a good job of kind of including several board members in those discussions with the county and some other places too. The D2A2, initiative. Again, that's an operational thing, but it fits into the overall larger planning scope of our ends and our overall strategic vision for the ride. And so, when we think about linking with our legal owners and then, our moral owners down the way, I want us to make sure that we get the best bang for our buck and put the time and the effort of the board members where it's going to do the most good. Now, if that's just meeting with mayors and city councils, that's going to be one thing. But as you said, we run the risk of just kind of getting a lot of operational constituent feedback over and over again. Do we link with the people who are taking a very specific, driven, pointed interest in some of these, things like transit-oriented development, the climate czar that the city has set up, a kind of the climate control office, the regional planning stuff with other places. So do you have a view to that or recommendation about that? Or has the Ownership Linkage Task Force decided or talked about, a focus of one or the other or both, or how do you see that issue?
Well, I'll give my opinion, but I'm not going to necessarily be giving the opinion of the task force or anybody else. Keeping in mind, in terms of like what Rose just said, in terms of long-term focus, big picture focus, where do you draw the line? Let's take transit-oriented development as an example. I think in terms of talking about the concepts of transit-oriented development, about potential areas where that would be useful and beneficial, I think, at least in my opinion, that is certainly where board members can and probably should be involved. When you get more into the detail, then we're going to have this particular development on Washington Avenue, and it's going to have this component to it and that component to it. And I really don't know where to draw the line, other than it's pretty high line. It doesn't get down into much detail. But more specifically, I can't answer that question. It's a very tough question. As I said, that's my personal view.
Kyra, did you want to jump in?
That's the view of every. Looks like Kyra wants to comment on that too.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Mike said. It's not something that we've directly talked about in the task force, but I think, Eric, to your point, and something that Rose said earlier, kind of tie in with the, I think Rose called it secondary data. So when we think about things like the 820 plan or transit-oriented development, things like that, we can take, instead of having I think the first step is still having the meetings with our legal owners and getting that momentum going that we had started to build up pre-pandemic. I think that's the initial first step that the task force wants to get going on a consistent basis. But I think it's important, initially we had the conversation about our ends. We can go back and have another conversation about our revised ends. But now we do have additional information from that secondary data that we can have a more, like, if the conversation does go, yeah, these ends look great, and then that's the end of the conversation, then we do have these other topics that we can discuss with the groups from the different bodies that we're meeting with that can help us flush out what the details of those ends, what's going to need to be done to accomplish those ends. So I think we can have those big picture discussions that will have to be more detailed, but I think it's just having those discussions first, and those topics, Eric, that you brought up are naturally going to come up in those meetings, I think.
Anybody else want to?
Yeah, and I
address
guess
that?
just to respond to Kara real quick, and I'll go to Jesse. Yeah, I guess my thought, I don't disagree with you. My thought was, are we better off driving the discussion with the legal owners and then going to the secondary sources armed with whatever we hear from the legal owners, or does it work in reverse? So in other words, should we be engaging whatever city task force is, talking about downtown planning, or the 820 or whatever it is, then going to the legal owners to say, this is what we see in the future, what do you think? Or do we get direction from them first to say, well, here's what the city's working on and we want you to be a part of that? I think Matt and the staff have engaged in a very kind of at a administrative bureaucratic level with their counterparts at the city and with the region and everything else. But it's not clear to me how we drive that upward to the legal owners and what we expect to get at those meetings when we do that. So, I mean, are we looking for their approval? Are we looking for a different direction? Are we looking for just some input? Is it all the above? Are we kind of looking for direction on some things? Giving them recommendations, getting recommendations from us. I mean, for the most part, they look to us for the expertise, right? They look for us to say, here's where we think things are going. And they'll say, yeah, that's great, but we have some other ideas in mind. My own inclination is to say, we need to drive the discussions with them. But if the goal of the meeting is to get their input and then act on that, we're kind of being more reactive than proactive. Then I think we have to talk about just that very 30,000 foot level direction. Are we going to be proactive or reactive when we have these legal owner meetings? And I think that kind of drives a series of other discussions about steps we take after that to make one or the other.
Eric, let me give you my kind of perspective on that. To me, we're being proactive by focusing on them on our ends and having them understand our ends. And then we should be reactive to what their input is. That isn't to say we agree with it, or because we don't really, that's not necessarily what we would want to do if we don't agree with it, but it provokes a dialogue. And then they will say, well, we're doing this. And which would be I hope a kind of a broad objective of theirs. And does that fit? That might involve us. What does AAA think about that? Again, it's pretty hard to script any of this. because we don't know what will happen. But I really, the more I've thought about this, and including at our meeting today, it just seems like absolutely the ends is the starting point, and we're the ones who present the ends. Yeah, Matt.
Thank you. And it's occurred to me sort of listening to this, when I speak with elected officials, and I do speak to the mayors and the supervisors probably most frequently, inevitably questions about sort of what they want from the ride come up, either prompted or unprompted, or what they'd like to see us do. And very often it starts as a very specific operational request. And sometimes I'll probe, and you may have heard that thing about ask why 5 times, and I'll kind of do that. And sometimes when you get down to it, the request really there is like a fundamental underlying value at stake. And let's say it starts with a bus stop. They want a bus stop here and they think it should have a shelter, and that's how they express it. And if any of you were sitting in the meeting with me, that may be how they start. But if we probe a little bit further, we may find out that they feel that there are a lot of seniors in that particular neighborhood, and that they really think that seniors should be, frankly, taken care of. And that's why that they think a shelter should be there, not just irregardless of how many people use it, because the people who are using it really need somewhere to sit because they're seniors. But that they don't express that at the first glance. They just think about the material thing they're trying to achieve, not necessarily the underlying reason. But if one of you were in that room with me, I think it would be useful for you to see that flower opening, that thinking begin to reveal itself about, oh, they think seniors really are important. And I use that because we all know that that's so. But is that something that should be extrapolated into more of your policies? That sort of thing, beyond just this one instance of this one bus stop, and have you adequately covered it in your policies? I think that's the kind of back and forth. It's iterative. It's not clear. I suspect it's going to be messy at times. And on occasion, they will not have an underlying greater value or one that can be easily expressed or publicly expressed. But then okay, that's what that is. So those are just some thoughts I have listening to the conversation.
Jesse, did you have a hand up before?
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say much of what Matt just said. I was going to use a different example, but I think he did. I'll go with his. But I think that this speaks to the importance of having staff present, but letting us drive the conversation. So, if someone says, if we're in a meeting with Chris Taylor and he says, I think you should be buying electric buses, we can say, thanks, Matt, make a note of that. So what is it about electric, what is it that you're hoping that you think those electric buses will accomplish? And that gets into, the ecological goals he might have. And that's really more into our ends. I mean, I think our ends are important the way Mike said, but I think even further going beyond the ends, but asking those open-ended questions, because if you ask, do you like our ends, it becomes a yes or no question. And if they answer yes, then our conversation is over, shake hands and call it a day. But asking I think those operational questions can serve as an avenue into the broader, like what's behind them. And that's where I think it's going to be important for us to understand that and to try and ask those whys that Matt was talking about, because that's what's going to have to inform, that's what we need to be getting out of ownership linkage. And the operational things are important for operations. And I think it's important for us to figure out what's the driving consideration, the philosophical consideration behind what they're asking.
I know we're more than an hour into our meeting already, and probably we should be moving on, but before we do, I'd like to hear if Rose has any comments or observation about these discussions we've just had.
No, my comment is that you've clearly done, a lot of thinking about kind of the direction that you want to go and engaging people. I guess a couple of things that occurred to me. One is that it might be helpful to try and set up the specifics of a schedule. So you've got some general ideas, but year one, here's kind of the specific meetings we might want to have, or the specific, and then be able to also, if the occasion arises, take advantage of that opportunity, but know, yes, we're going to do this. And that, because I think it's easier to try and, engage the fuller board if you know kind of the specifics of what's going to happen and when, and what's the kind of general orientation. So if it's, you're starting with your ends and you have some, some backup, or it's a conversation that starts in a different place, that you want to kind of, we'll just call it the ask the whys, to kind of get at the underlying values and things. So that would be one comment, was just to try and get at the specificity. The other thing that twigged for me was something, I can't remember who was talking about this, but that it is possible in conversations that priorities, values aren't necessarily related to ends policies, but might be related to or relevant or inform, either executive limitations, because you may gain a sense of, the nature of, either risk tolerance or things that are important to legal owners, about either the limitations that you set around the means, or even related to your own process, for example. So, you want to be paying attention to that, that part of the conversation, as well as, the ends related future directions conversation. So those would be my two observations. I mean, I think you've set off on a really good path, and yeah.
Okay, thanks, Rose. And before I allow Eric to go get onto the rest of his agenda, I'd like to ask one more time, are there any other board members, based on what we've said here, if you'd like to add any thoughts of yours, any questions that you still haven't, that you still are confused about, or any?
My only question might be, did you want to talk about the board draft at all, or tonight, or did you want to just have it?
I'm sorry?
Did you want to talk about this draft ownership 3-year linkage plan that was in the packet tonight, or did you want that for another time?
Do we have time?
Sure. I mean, I think Roger was going to say something first, but I
Okay,
just want to know
Roger.
if you were going to discuss it.
No, I just lost my signal for a little bit. That's all. I'm back.
Okay. And actually, I'd like to throw that question from Eric over to the person who drafted that and did it really, and we really liked it. And that happens to be Rich.
Oh boy. All right. Let me get to that page. So what we really wanted to do was take that summary page that Mike, Kyra, and Jesse had actually worked on, because actually I joined the task force only about a couple months ago. And what we decided was providing a bit more detail as to a bit like what Kathleen was asking. We're just like, well, how do we approach this? How do we implement this? So we said, look, let's break it down by year, with the majority of the focus being in year one, because years 2 and 3 will actually be the result of the outcomes from year one. And for us to kind of map and plan that out is going to be pretty difficult. So the who for year one is, of course, us as the board, and then the legal owners, and that'd be Ann Arbor City Council, Ypsi City Council, and Ypsilanti Township Board of Trustees. And then we had a lot of discussions within the committee of just like, well, who exactly are we going to talk to in those organizations? And that's something for us as a board to actually determine at a later date. That doesn't have to be decided right now. and it can actually be more a case-by-case basis. There are some conversations, like we said, that are going on. So for instance, I'm chatting with some folks through the DDA, and there's some city council members that participate in that. And that's kind of like, not really checking the box, but that actually is a way that we're communicating and having interactions with some of the folks that are part of the Ann Arbor City Council. And then really just break this down into a vision and purpose. Why are we doing this? How are we potentially going to do it? And then what are some of the desired outcomes? And all this is not set in stone. This is just more to get some potential words on paper that will then hopefully further some discussion out of us to maybe say like, okay, as a group, do we take this and just run with it, or do we tweak it, make some modifications, and go from there? I don't know if you really want me to go through every word in here, but I think that was just more of potentially taking some of those questions that we may have on how do we implement this and outlining it into hopefully some kind of playbook that we can work from.
Thanks, Rich. You proved my point that you did a better job of explaining that than I would have.
I don't know about that.
But now that we're focusing on that particular page, I'd like to hear any feedback from anybody on what's there, including Rose, if she wanted to add anything. But I'm maybe even more interested in hearing from board members. Roger, were you just, yes, Roger.
Well, I just, past experience, I'd say, meeting in small groups is going to be probably much more effective. 2 to 3 meetings might be overstretching it to begin with, but how much is listening to what they say, how much is trying to get them to focus on the longer range, bigger picture things. But I definitely think starting off with, particularly if anybody has working relationships with any of the legal owners, that'd be a good starting point. Again, small meetings.
Yeah, in the meetings of the task force, we really never talked about anything other than small meetings, because for the same reason you're suggesting, the larger the meeting, probably the less effective, the least effective it will be. Just too many people, too many voices. Anybody else have anything that they want to add or ask?
I'll just simply add, I appreciate the work that went into this. I think it's kind of straightforward. It makes sense to me. I think, the devil in the detail will come for time for execution, right? When we actually have to schedule meetings and sit down with folks and who does what and what do we present. But I think this is a good framework to work off of. So, thanks to the committee that worked on this, and thanks to Rich for putting thought into it and making it in a way that's kind of a quick reference in this nice tabular form. So,
well, I can't take all the credit. So Jesse, Kyra, Mike, actually, I just took their thoughts and put it on a piece of paper. So definitely not me.
Well, the task force will be having another meeting within the next month, and presumably we talked about timing wise enough to have some additional proposed actions before the next board meeting. And this, Rose, your help today and everybody else's comments today have, I think, been very helpful to us. And I hope we can bring forth maybe next board meeting some more specific proposals that we can talk about. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Just in closing, my comments are these. One, just give some thought. I would like the task force to give some thought about that balance about, are we, meeting with the legal owners to drive the secondary stuff, or do we, do the secondary research and then meet with the legal owners? And then 2, think about a little more narrowly about who those legal owners are. Is it just a mayor? Is it just a very interested elected official at some level? And if by legal owners, of course, we've always defined that as the the elected officials of the jurisdictions that make up our articles of incorporation. And do we want to expand that at all to mean more advocacy on other levels at either the county? What we've seen over the last couple of years is the county's playing a much more active role, particularly in regional matters. And particularly, where the politics of Washington, D.C. are changing. We're going to talk about that very shortly here, and even at the state level. So technically, we've always defined legal owners a certain way, but I just would ask the task force to kind of expand. Do we want to make that advocacy or that outreach, that connection, that linkage just narrowly there, or are there other people who can be influential for us and to us that we might want to expand our circle with? Those are just I don't have answers, just give it some thought.
Well, that's a good thing to think about, Eric, is we all know, particularly if regional transit comes up again, the county will be very much involved. And they were the last time around too.
Yes.
And had we had more involvement with them earlier, that might have been better. Probably would have been.
Anybody else? Okay. Thank you again, Mike, and the complete task force. I echo what Raymond said. This is a lot of work, and we appreciate your dedication to this topic. Very important for us to do.
And thank you, Rose.
And thank you, Rose.
I apologize for being late. I just got my directions confused. So
it's all right.
I was waiting on GoToMeeting, which was not where you were. So, but that was my fault.
That's all right. Thank you. We'll move on then to section 4, federal advocacy update. And this is discussion. We'll turn it over to Matt. And I think Jesse and Mike will also assist here.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and for all the members of the board. One of the delegated functions that the CEO is responsible for is sort of liaising with elected leaders, particularly grantors and funders throughout the country. Most of those are obviously local and state, but the federal government here in the U.S. plays a big role as well. Every year, our National Industry Association, the American Public Transit Association, or APTA, hosts a very scheduled, formal delegation to Washington, D.C. They encourage transit agencies across the country to descend on D.C. for a week of cicada-like. We descend on Washington, D.C. to speak with our elected officials. Not that that's on my mind or anything right now. And so we've done this a couple of times, and this year we did it virtually. And I asked you, Mr. Chairman, to reach out to some board members to see who would be interested in accompanying me. Rich Chang a few moments ago made, I think, an excellent point about how it can be very helpful to have sort of a buddy system when doing these meetings, particularly when we're trying to, I don't want to say sell, but engage elected officials and grantors in the work that TheRide's doing. It's good to hear from staff, but it's even better, I think, in some ways, to hear from the residents of the community, the constituents of that community, who are passionate enough about the subject to go so far as to sit on a board of directors. I think that kind of volunteering activity carries a lot of weight and gravitas when speaking with congresspersons, senators, representatives. And so Mike and Jesse and I participated in this meeting yesterday, actually. Very well organized, I thought, by APTA. They did an excellent job, good training ahead of time. And I'm going to ask Jesse and Mike to speak about their experience in a moment, because this is something I'd love to get more of you involved in. But we had 3 virtual meetings. Unfortunately, we were not able to speak to any of the elected officials themselves. They were all indisposed, but we spent quite a bit of time with their staff, which is, in my experience, frankly, what we can expect, and that's okay. We had a very, I think, focused message, even though we had 5 to 7 people on each call. We did meet with Debbie Dingell's staff. We met with Senator Peters' staff and Senator Stabenow's staff. Those 2 meetings were much more like Michigan-wide meetings. We had folks from Flint and Grand Rapids on the phones with us as well. Overall, I think it was a success. We got some good information. We made more contacts. I now know specifically who to call about future earmarking and legislative opportunities. So I thought it was a successful trip, and I was very happy to have a couple of board members there with me because I think that really rounded out our representation. So at this point, I'd like to ask maybe Jesse to start and just relay his thoughts, and then Mike, love to hear from you.
Sure. So as I've mentioned a couple times in meetings, I'm becoming a little bit more involved with APTA. I signed up for a webinar once, and then they started sending me emails, and all of a sudden I realized I was on a committee. And I double checked with Matt to say, is that right, or did they make a mistake? And he said, no, that's the way APTA works. But it's been enjoyable. I'm on the Transit Board Members Committee of APTA, and I've been finding it very helpful to be to kind of hear what's going on in other transit agencies around the country. And so I found out about this. They really did a great job with the training. There was a whole, they took care of all the scheduling, let us know who we were going to be meeting with, who was going to be, despite the disappointment in not meeting with the legislators themselves, I found staff to be, they weren't phoning it in. They were there, they were involved, they asked questions. The senators had staff that were specifically dedicated to transportation issues and ecological issues. Matt, what he didn't mention was actually APTA for each meeting would assign a couple of leads, and Matt was delegated as a lead for all of our meetings. And it was really helpful having him there. He was able to clearly state the asks, some of which were, prompted by APTA, the service transportation reauthorization, as well as support for President Biden's infrastructure proposal. Matt also had some more wonky asks, but were really no less important. I think the one that really stuck out is the reverting the appropriation is the right word of funding, of roads versus transportation to pre-2012 levels. And Matt may want to correct me on some of my terms or on that, but basically that there'd been a change that happened in 2012, which had effectively decimated the nationwide bus fleet, and that we were, as an agency, have been able to weather through cuts to other capital resources like our roof. And Matt was able to very effectively communicate that and how important that a reversion to the pre-2012 formula, how important that would be. I found it very rewarding. Many thanks to the staff for Senator Stabenow Peters and Representative Dingell. They did a great job. They asked follow-up questions. And I feel confident that we formed some relationships there that will serve us well going forward.
And I agree with Jesse. I found the meetings to be quite productive. The staff really were paying attention. I thought Matt did a terrific job, as Jesse mentioned. Matt was really the lead person in all 3 of these meetings, and 2 of the 3 were statewide offices. And he was very organized. He knew the wonky details of what bills were in front of Congress and what transportation might play in them, and specifically what could benefit the kinds of agencies that we are and the other ones that we're participating too. Matt also did a good job of organizing Jesse and me on what would be our best role, which was specifically try to make it personal to us. in terms of our involvement in the communities, particularly that we are in. And I think that was very helpful. Another thing, and man, I don't think I've had an opportunity to tell you this yet, but I think it was very educational for Jesse and me to understand an important part of your job, and that's dealing with the mega funder there in Washington and how you do it. And that gives me a better understanding of the operation of AATA. It really does. And what's really important. And Matt did get their attention, and Jesse, you could see that he already had a good relationship there with some of them. And as Jesse mentioned, that one chart that Matt put up that showed how the funding for buses just took a nosedive. I think it was, can't remember what year that was. But that really got the attention of a couple of staff people. They weren't aware of that at all. And one or two of them asked, please send that chart. So that was another very positive thing about these meetings.
I'm really glad Mike mentioned the storytelling. It was something I meant to mention. In participating in the transit board committee, it's very obvious that one of the things they would like board members to be doing is really serving that role of we're as board members in a much better position to tell the story about where all this funding is going and how it's being used and how it's benefiting the community, and I think even more so than staff is. And it was really nice to be able to, and I think Stephen Higashide mentioned that when he came and spoke to us, that when I think Eric asked, what can we be doing as a board? That was his saying. That's what he was saying, is that we can be out there doing more of that public outreach and telling those stories. So having an opportunity to do that, to people who, we did not get to speak to the legislators, but we got to speak to, effectively speak to their office, and having an opportunity to put that idea into practice. I'm looking forward to doing that more. And I think with the millage campaigns coming up, I think we as a board have an opportunity to do more of this sort of thing.
Thank you. Matt, anything in closing that you wanted to finish it off with?
We came away with a handful of new names and of staff people that we could speak to, which actually in some of the senators' perspective was something we didn't have before. So that's good. But I also learned something, and I learned it from Jesse, about how to effectively use the background in your Zoom call. Jesse very effectively was able to put pictures of his son up riding the bus on the wall behind him very quickly. There you go. Just to hammer home the point that it's a family affair for him and his family, and then used the YTC in the background and referred to it several times. So I thought that was a very clever and innovative way to get some things through there. And now I have to learn how to actually use this technology a little bit better. He's raised the bar.
Any questions from board members? Any comments? I mean, if other board members want to participate in the future or get more involved in this kind of thing, please let us know. But based on what we've heard, it sounds like it was well worth the time and effort to get us all involved. So like Jesse, I look forward to doing more of this kind of work, and we'll keep an eye out for more opportunities for people. Do we want to move on then to 4.2, the long range plan board retreat follow-up, Gold Ride, I think in particular. So I'll turn it back over to Matt and Brian.
Thank you. And I'm really just going to flip it over to Brian, but I'll set it up. You may recall at the retreat, we talked about the future of fixed route and on-demand types of services. And we are continuing to sort of break it into chunks. And Forrest will be coming forward in future months to talk to you in more detail about the fixed route side of things. But there's a pressing issue having to do with the on-demand side of our services, having to do with Gold Ride, and we'll have one of our speakers in the public comment section mentioned that. It's an important service, and it's something, frankly, it's the path forward hasn't been that clear. So Brian has a new proposal for your consideration and feedback this evening, and we think it's something that might be a good sort of middle way forward. It does include decisions that have been delegated to me, but it also includes some important decisions that the board has reserved for itself. So this is not entirely a decision that staff can action on our own. We will need the board's support. So with that, I will turn it over to Brian Smith, our head of operations. Take it away.
Thank you, Matt. And I'm going to share my screen, just making sure that's showing up properly. Quickly. Yes. Okay.
Looks good.
Good. So talking tonight about Gold Ride, and purpose this evening is to really first learn how to advance the slides. There we go. Update the board on the options that you'd requested at the last board meeting and determine the board support for a new Gold Ride fare structure. And this evening, the plan is to talk about the background and the challenges a little bit of what Gold Ride was, go over the new recommendations, and then chat about next steps and open it up for discussion with the board. So pre-pandemic, pre-2020, Gold Ride was a legacy program for seniors in Ann Arbor. It offered a free fare on fixed route services and $4 on-demand taxi service. Historically, AATA had delivered this service with its TheRide service. There were challenges to it. It was very expensive. We were providing to an expanding demographic. It was commingled in with the federally required programs of the complimentary paratransit, the ADA service. So we couldn't deny trips, and fares are capped. And it was not equitable geographically, as you can see here, because it only serviced Ann Arbor and a limited portion of Pittsfield Township. And it had limited access for seniors using mobility devices. So that's the slide for the future here. As people look at this, they can look at the slide and go over it. But to give you an idea, you'll recognize this slide from previous presentations where all of these services were bundled together. However, in reality, Gold Ride kind of sat off to the side because it wasn't available everywhere. And one of the things we needed to do was fix that inequity. We also had historic high growth and costs. The purchase transportation was the largest growth item in the budget year after year, especially following the 5Y TIP, where we greatly expanded the reach of our door-to-door service. And looking out into the future, the trend was predicted to continue in that way. And so just to remind everybody of our timeline, in February, due to the high costs and those historic high costs and the predicted growing ones, staff had proposed canceling the on-demand Gold Ride service, but retaining the free fixed route service for Gold Ride. In March, we had public feedback that indicated a strong support for the continuing program. And in April, the board, concerned about both finances and the community need, directed us to develop alternative solutions. And so tonight, we bring to you an alternative solution for August of this year, but it does require further action to quickly get it in order for service to be restored by this August. So we would traditionally bundle those services. They didn't have the separate service areas, and we had the growing costs. So what do we do? How do we fix that? The solutions that we have were to unbundle those services and manage them separately, as suggested by the paratransit study. This would allow us to meet the federal requirements, institute pricing limits, and resolve the geographic equity concerns. So you'll recall this slide from another presentation. And our recommended approach then is to reinstate the on-demand Gold Ride, split it apart from a ride. This would allow us to have limited capacity. It would allow us to have a fare structure that was not capped by our fixed route fare. And we would also propose to expand the service area. Should be noted that the board of directors is the only authority for changing the fare. And without further ado, I present to you the proposed map of Gold Ride service. I took some liberties and called it Gold Ride 2.0. How original. So as you can see, this would cover both Ann Arbor City, Ypsilanti City, and portions of Ypsilanti Township. It would provide that service within 3/4 of a mile of all of our fixed routes within our member jurisdictions, plus Pittsfield, which has been paying for the Gold Ride service under their purchase of service agreement. Fares we would propose to set at $20 a ride and $5 for each additional passenger for general senior population, and a discount fare of $5 a ride for seniors with low income. Probably the most difficult part of this whole problem is to try to figure out what to budget for in terms of ridership. And what staff would propose at this time is that our best estimate for ridership, we had in 2019, 12,000 trips. We are adding about 50% of an area to cover for this service. And we are increasing the cost. So we have an expanded area, which will increase the number of rides we have. And then we're proposing an increased cost, which will reduce the number of rides we have. And then we have this little thing, the pandemic, and people still nervous about riding and what have you. So the best guess we can come up with is a highest ridership estimate of 16,000 trips in a year. We will work with our contractor to not try to bring on too much capacity too soon so that we have waste, but at the same time work with them so that we don't have denials to the point where the service doesn't meet the needs that the public is looking for. This will allow us to maintain a valued service while fixing and controlling the cost. We can set that budget. A large difference between the budget of a ride and the budget of Gold Ride is that a ride, we have to, every call for a ride, we have to accommodate. We're not allowed to have a pattern of denials. With Gold Ride, while it might be something that we try to avoid, we could certainly have a denial of a ride and not be in violation of a civil right. The return of Gold Ride ideally is done this August, so that as we're talking about service restoration, it comes back when the rest of it does. In order to do this, we would have to share the revised Gold Ride plan with the public in June. If the board felt it worked this way, we could then have a fair decision by July and implement that service in August. And there's discussion to be had along those lines. My first question for the board would be, do you need any more information or clarity around it? And then for the new fares, there would be two options that I would put forth to the board. Is tonight, if you would like, you could approve the amount for public comment at the June meetings and say that that fare structure is reasonable and you'd like to hear what the public has to say, and then grant the CEO authority to finalize after the public comment period. Or alternately, we could bring it back to you in July for voting on it then. And my dog is not to be outdone and needs to weigh in as well.
Sounds supportive. Rich, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I just had a couple questions. So just to make sure I'm fully understanding this, so with the split off from a ride, that means that it sounds like we're going to be using a different vendor would provide these type of services. So they'll provide the vehicles, the personnel, all we're doing is just paying them for this service?
Yes, we have an existing contract with Golden Limousine to provide Flex Ride, and they provide our Flex Ride, our Holiday Ride, and our Night Ride service currently. And we have a proposal from them to provide this service as well.
Okay, and then so is the cost, our cost is basically what they're charging us. Is there going to be some like long length of agreement, right? Because the thing that I'm just concerned with is we ran into potential cost issues. This vendor, as they get into this, say like 6 months or even a year from now, they go, oh, actually, this is going to cost us way more money than we thought between wear and tear, fuel costs, or whatever. Are they able to turn around as their terms of service says, like they can raise the rate X amount over X amount of time, or is it locked in for a longer period of time?
So this would be, we've proposed either a 12-month or possibly a maximum of 2-year agreement with Golden Limousine. At a 12-month period, we would keep this price the same throughout that time frame. I'm pretty confident that they have looked at their costs and said, you know, they're familiar with what their costs will be. So I'm confident that we would be able to maintain that price for the year. And I think there are actually alternate ways that we could look at delivering this service that might not be quite so costly. We couldn't do was get any of those alternate ways of providing this service up and running by August. So I'm comfortable with the price that we've gotten, and that it won't exceed that for the year or 18 months or so that we might have it in place in this fashion.
Got it. I mean, yeah, this is great. And I love the expansion of the service area. I mean, I think that's a huge one. Thank you.
Sorry, Jesse, go ahead.
So the $20 fee, that pretty much matches the cost of an Uber ride. Like whenever I've had to go home from downtown Ann Arbor to Ypsilanti, it's been $15 Lyft or Uber. So, you know, extrapolating that out, that $20 kind of covers the Lyft or Uber cost. Or at least doesn't seem particularly competitive with it. So I'm trying to, I was maybe trying to figure out why someone would take Gold Ride at that price. Because, you know, if they have, you know, if they qualify for the discounted rate, then they're going to take the discounted rate. And so we're not recouping those costs. And, you know, if we're providing some services like, oh, they have a walker, then they probably qualify for a ride, and they'd be maybe better served by a ride. So I'm trying to figure out who this $20 fee, who is that for?
So in one of the previous presentations, I had given the example of a Ann Arbor resident who was a millionaire and a marathon runner. And are we in a situation where we should be subsidizing their trip? And essentially the answer that we got back as we talked with the board was no, I don't think we should be subsidizing the trip of somebody who has no limitations, particularly on their income. And so the $20 was intended to be set at a rate that we would not be in competition with private vendors, so that we weren't competing with the private market, because it wasn't a role that we should be necessarily playing, of taking tax dollars and competing with the public. One of the unexpected consequences of the pandemic and the problem in hiring is that Uber and Lyft have actually dramatically raised their prices over the last 2 weeks. And so the trip that you talk about $15, when I first started researching this, that was what I had found as well. That same trip is now $25 or $30. Now that I would imagine may not last forever. But at the moment, the $20 ride, even with a $5 add-on for additional riders, might still be a bargain for a senior who has the means. And then anybody that has that would qualify for a low income program would be able to ride for the $5.
So I guess what I'm wondering, if the $20 fee is not appealing to people and then they don't use it, and we're serving the majority of the people we're serving are the discounted rides, how does that affect the budget projection? Like, are we just kicking the can by doing this?
So originally we had proposed at the service committee a $10 fare for low income seniors. To drop that fare from $10 to $5 was $30,000 over a year. Off of a $750,000 price tag, that was estimated to not be really something that was realistic in terms of what the cost of reimbursement was. And as this would be a relatively short-term contract, while we worked out a more cost-effective way to do it, it doesn't substantially impact the bottom line. Even the $20 fare doesn't cover the cost, is essentially what it comes down to.
Roger, go ahead.
Besides being a senior, how would one qualify for a reduced fare based on income? What would be the process?
So if you qualify for a program that is connected to having low income, rather than us certifying ourselves by asking people for copies of their income statements or their taxes or anything like that, if you would qualify for subsidized housing, for example, we have multiple agencies that we have certified as low income representatives, and they can register their clients, and then they send in that application to us. We review it to make sure that it's complete and accurate and what have you, and then would grant that status of the $5 fare at that point, and the rider would then be logged as that in that category with the provider.
Kathleen?
Hey, Brian. So I really appreciate you listening to all of our feedback at the last few meetings. I'm pleased to see that you did reduce the fare to $5 for low income seniors. I may not be what everybody wants for right now, but I think that bringing it back online, first of all, is very pleasing as well, and expanding the service area. I am very concerned still about the $20 fare. I do understand that we do have residents that have higher incomes possibly than others, and so that $20 might be within their reach. For me, your ask about creating a new fare, I would prefer to hear what the public has to say at their engagement about the proposal of the $20 fare, regular fare, $5 fare as the for a low income, and then hear how the public reacts to it, have that information brought back to us. And then I think it would be better for us the board, not the CEO, to make the fair decision in July. I don't know that I feel comfortable making a decision before hearing from the public. I really do think the public input is key here.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. That helps answer one of the questions on the board.
Any other comments, questions, board members? Just to answer, oh, sorry, go ahead, Rich.
Yeah, actually, I had a few. You mentioned that there is an easier, or I guess a way to actually deny requests. Like, what are some of the reasons that we would deny a request for a ride?
denials that I was referring to would be a capacity denial, where if we have more calls or more requests, for example, an 8 o'clock trip, then we have vehicles available. In the ADA complementary paratransit world, you just have to find another vehicle. You don't have a choice. It is obligated that we would honor those requests. And there's parameters that we can follow with those, of offering alternative times and what have you. But with GoldRide, we would still do that same negotiation of trying to find something that would work for the client, so that they could get where they needed to go. But for the ADA service, if we can't find a ride within a window of time, we have to log it as a denial of service. And then that gets audited by the FTA, and we have to explain it if there's a pattern or practice of it. With premium services, we would still log that as a capacity denial. I would still bring that forward to the board and report those so that you were aware of them, but we would not be subject to an audit by the FTA to say, why did you have this pattern or practice of denials? You're not allowed to do that. You're violating the law.
Okay, got it. And then I guess my last question, it's in line, I think, with the many questions that have been asked around the fair. So for the budgets, no matter whether someone does the $20 or the $5, we're responsible for $20 per whatever passenger is to the vendor, correct? So if we have 99% of our riders during this, when this goes into effect, are actually fall under the $5 reduced fare, I assume we still have to pay $20 for each of those to the vendor?
We're on the hook to pay the cost of the trip, and the cost of the trip is quite variable depending on what the demand is. But the cost of the trip, even if we had the full demand of 16,800 trips, the cost of each trip is around $42. And so we would still need to pay the $42 a trip, whether the passenger paid 20 or if they paid 5.
And so is that budget number then so that's 16,800 rides times whatever, 43? Are you able to pull that slide up maybe that you had the budget amount?
So I can. One second.
Okay. Yeah.
The difficulty, I will just warn that we can divide $750,000 by 16,000 and come up with a per ride cost, but that would assume that we would put out the full level of service on day one, and we're incurring that full cost throughout the year. But that also, we experience that full demand on day one, and we're able to divide the full budget by the full number of trips. What we anticipate with the vendor is that we will bring back a reasonable level of service based on our expertise and their expertise about the on-demand service world, and see how that goes, see what the demand is for those services, and then take it from there in terms of adding. But what we can say is that the budget would be capped at that amount. So coming up with a hard and fast, this is the cost of every trip, we'll know it in retrospect. Guessing ahead of time, we're giving our best estimates here. I don't want to represent like this is a scientific fact. This is our best.
Well, that makes sense. So then I guess off of that, do we owe the vendor a minimum? So like we guarantee we'll pay them for X number of rides, say 20 rides a day. And if we only have 5, we still owe them for 20 rides for that day.
They have proposed a floor of about 20% of our highest estimated ridership. So they are looking for a floor amount where they need a certain amount just to cover the cost of staffing the vehicles and doing the work.
Sure.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Brian.
Mhm.
Anyone else? Okay, just to maybe get to Brian's questions on that very last slide, maybe Brian, if you can put those up again real quick. Do any board members want any more information and or do we feel comfortable making a decision today? Or generally speaking, waiting until maybe July to do that, making a decision on fares? Can I just
Send them back up here in 1 second. Sorry.
no problem. But just getting input from the board, I think we heard from Kathleen and her views on it. Does anybody have a different view than Kathleen about starting with the second question, waiting for the public comments in the June meeting first before we make a recommendation or finalize our decision?
I agree with that. I think also maybe we need some more discussions internally.
Okay, does anybody disagree with Rich and Kathleen? Okay. Is anybody else, in addition to more discussion, is there any more? My pit bull's not going to be outdone either. Does anybody else have any more information they want to see directly from the from the staff, from Brian here or Matt?
Well, I want to first just thank Brian and the staff for putting this together. I know it's not easy. So yeah, greatly appreciated.
No problem.
So if anybody thinks of anything, I mean, obviously don't hesitate to please let the staff know and let the rest of the board know, so we know what we don't have duplicate requests, and send that in. But what I'm hearing is that we will probably postpone a decision until the July meeting. I don't think we have to take a vote on it, but if anybody has a strong objection to that, now's the time. Okay, so I think we have our direction then, Brian and Matt, and we'll go forward from there.
Thank you, sir.
All right. No, thank you. And we'll move on to the next item on our agenda. It's 4.3, which is the August Service Recovery Plan update. I think this is going to be Forrest taking us through that.
Eric, before Forrest goes on, I thought Mike was trying to flag down your attention on that last item.
Oh, was it?
I was, on a completely unrelated matter, but in case anybody wants to live vicariously what Roger is experiencing right now, which is the sunset over Lake Michigan, I think you can see it in the window behind you.
Thanks for pointing that out. We weren't jealous enough, but thank you for pointing that out.
Okay, I'll turn around here, but it's getting cloudy, so probably no sunset tonight.
Yeah, please do make us.
I thought we could see it in the. I thought we could see it in the reflection in the window behind you. Yes, that's what we could see in the window, Roger.
Terrible, just terrible.
I move that we shut off Roger's video feed.
Yeah, can we do that from here? Keith, make that happen. Maybe Mike, somebody. Okay, Forrest, why don't we turn over to you?
All right, thanks. All right, first I want to thank the people who provide the feedback, our writers, staff, stakeholders, and members of the public. And as I mentioned before, we received over 300 comments. So we reviewed all the comments and we made some adjustment to the proposed service plan. We're in the process to finalize the materials for communication, public communication. By end of this month or beginning of June, you're probably going to receive an email package of communication from me, and then we're going to release to public first week or early June. Going back to the earlier question from a public member, the public town hall meetings will happen mid-June, late in June. That will be a combination of fare proposals and the service plan. So it's not only service plan, it will include the fare proposals and of course the TheRide proposal as well. So from there, we'll again hearing from the public, but we're not going to be able to incorporate the feedback in June into the final August service plan, but we'll take that into consideration in the future planning cycle, like January 2022 or later. So that's kind of our the timeline. But I want to mention, ask public members, watch our website newsletter for all the details about public town halls or the feedback period. So that's all from me.
Thank you, Forrest. Any comments, questions from board members on that? Okay. We'll move on then to 4.4, the Q2 service report. So I think it's back to Brian for that.
In the interest of time, I would submit to the board that you have the report and would be happy to answer any questions.
Any questions for Brian on the service report, which I think is covered in the service committee already, but it's anything for Brian on, or comments, questions on the service report? All right, we'll move on then to item 4.5, which is the Q2 finance report. So I think this is for Latasha. Turn it over to her.
All right, thank you, Eric. And I'm going to share my screen at this time. Hopefully I get this right. All right, does everyone see my screen? Okay, wonderful. So I'm going to do just one thing here. Okay, so you have the quarter package in your packet starting on page 66. And I just want to emphasize a few points as we get into the quarter report. And some of this information was already included in the package, but I just want to reemphasize it. The income statement that is included in the packet that you see includes our original adopted budget that was done in September 2020. It does not reflect that amended budget that was passed last month. I also want to emphasize that it does not reflect the funding strategy that we passed last month as well. And if you remember, that strategy was to rededicate our property taxes to a capital reserve and to increase our CARES funding or our draws from CARES funding so that we could cover operating costs. Those changes are going to be reported in the third quarter report. And we are working internally. I'm also working with the auditors and of course with the board as well, the finance committee, to exactly how we are going to present that information. So look forward to that in the third quarter. And I also just want to let you know that it does reflect the capital reserve resolution that was passed in January of this year, which was just $1 million. Obviously now we're talking a lot more money than $1 million than we were in January, but you'll see those changes in that presentation coming down the line. So I just wanted to emphasize that before we get into the actual results. Okay. As far as the results, it was a very similar story to the first quarter. We had a zero surplus for the second quarter. And the expenses were 18.7 million year to date, and that was 2.9 million less than the budget. And just to give you just a few highlights as to why we were less than the budget, obviously we are still in the pandemic during the second quarter, and so our expenses are still not as what we would expect. The ridership is down, the service level is down. One of the biggest variances that you'll see in that report is purchase transportation. And obviously we know that we're not doing we did not do the TheRide in the second quarter, and that's going to be taken over by the vendor as far as the responsibility of it and going forward. And we did not do D2A2, just to give some examples. As far as revenue, we had the same exact revenue number, 18.7 million, $2.9 million less than the budget. And as far as revenue goes, since our strategy is to break even, this was the pre-amendment strategy, our revenue that we pull from our federal grants is dictated by how many expenses we have. Since we didn't have as many expenses, that means that we did not pull as many federal dollars for this quarter. Also, we do have the lower ridership that's in place right now. And one thing that might have caught your eye is the state funding variance. That number actually was higher than the budget. And that is because the original number that we had in the budget needed to be updated to reflect what we are actually getting from the state, and hence why we had a budget amendment last month. Just want to reemphasize that we did get we have $4 million in CARES funding in this report, if you're wondering, and that is, again, under the pre-amendment strategy. And then on the balance sheet, I just want to hit just a few highlights. I know it's in your packet. We had a strong net position of about $69 million, which was very close to what we had last quarter. You'll see that our capital reserve there that I mentioned, our operating reserve was about 3 months. So we still have a very strong cash and investment position. And we did not have any significant changes in investments. Really, the only change from last quarter to this quarter is just the changes in the market. And so with that, I will end my highlights and I will entertain any questions at this time.
Thank you, Latasha. Any questions from board members about the Q2 financial statements? Roger?
Just so we're clear, so we're going to have revenues and expenses are going to equalize out because we are continuing to move CARES Act federal pandemic money in to match whatever our shortfall on revenue is. That continues to be correct.
I think if you're asking pulling CARES, I'm gonna have to get a lot of feedback, but I think if you're asking if we're pulling the federal funds to cover any losses of revenue, so when our expenses would exceed our revenue, that is correct. Is that what you're asking, Roger?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Yep.
Right. That's what I assumed. I just wanted to make sure I had it correctly.
You do. That's correct.
Thank you.
Others? Okay. All right, and we'll look forward to the reflected amended budget next quarter. So thank you, Latasha.
All right, thank you.
And then we'll move on to the CEO report. And I think it's back to Matt.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The report's in your packet. I just want to highlight a couple of things and note a few recent developments. You'll note a comment about back to work planning, and we are starting a lot of serious internal discussions about how and when to bring staff back into our office buildings. And as you might imagine, it's a complicated situation. We are both an operational facility with essential frontline workers who've been there this entire time. And we have professional office spaces with staff who've been working from home. So we're sorting all those things through right now. The state of Michigan is still sending out somewhat conflicting signals, but definitely is looking like returning to work is going to be a thing over the next few months. assuming no resurgence in the virus. For us, our situation, we're sorting out the details, but one big challenge I just want to highlight for you is actually staff parking. Seems innocuous, but before the pandemic, some of you may recall that we didn't have enough staff parking. Now, this was a result of the expansions of 2013 and 2014 and increasing the number of bus drivers, but also some office staff as well. We ran out of places for people to park. And as a result, we had to begin parking people within our bus garage. And that's generally something that was never done before. But it worked sort of, because the buses would pull out early in the morning, and there were enough of them gone before 9 a.m. that when office staff began to arise, there was some space that had been freed up. And so we were able to make that work. And that worked pretty well until the pandemic landed a year or so back. And at that point, you may recall that we were about to hand off our paratransit fleet to a new contractor. Well, we scrubbed that. Brian's bringing that one back now for August. But the paratransit fleet, we've been operating that in-house this whole time with our regular staff, and our maintenance staff have been taking care of those buses, and those buses and vehicles have been in the barn, in the garage. A lot of our fixed route fleet was mothballed and stored at a different location. We're bringing it out of mothballs, but now we have not enough garage space for the fixed route fleet, the paratransit fleet, and staff parking. So our handoff is going to happen in August. When we get a new paratransit contractor on board and spun up, we will hand the fleet off to them. They will take it back to their own new facility, which is what we have been doing for decades prior to this. So this is a very routine activity for us. At that point, we're going to have the fixed route fleet move back in and completely take up all the space that they used to take. And then we will get back, I think, to our old habits of accommodating staff parking. On top of, but obviously we can't do that until the paratransit fleet's gone. So that happens in August. So the earliest, frankly, that we're going to be able to do this, logistically speaking, is going to be September. That's just a reality as we get back out of the pandemic. Beyond that, as many employers are doing, we're also having a lot of internal conversations about what's the new reality about hybrid work. Are we going to have people in the office every day? Now that remote work, we know that it can work. Maybe we can be more flexible in working arrangements. So we're exploring that. We're very interested to see what we can do there for staff. Productivity has actually been pretty good over the last year for staff who've been working from home. I say pretty good, I mean excellent. You know, no payroll has been disrupted. Your meetings have not been disrupted. The work of the authority has gone on very well. So we've demonstrated that it can work, but in many ways it's not ideal. Communication has suffered. Collaboration has probably become slower. So it's not ideal, but it can work. So we're going to explore those options. And I just wanted to let you guys kind of know how staff are being accommodated as we begin that transition back. Of course, we're still keeping our eye on public safety. And if, you know, right now cases are trending down, a lot of people are getting vaccinated. That's just wonderful. If for some reason those numbers turn around and start going in a negative way again, you know, we may continue keeping people at home as much as we can, not just for their safety, but also to reduce the sheer number of people who have to be in the building at any one time. We feel that that's safer for the people who are there, the frontline workers, as well as the people who are staying at home. We've had a good couple of meetings now with the local advisory council, the LAC. You may recall we passed a new policy. You passed a new policy a month or so back. Kathleen and I have had a couple of discussions with the chair and vice chair of the council. We talked to the entire council a couple weeks ago. So we're starting the process of updating them on the board's new expectations and policies and how we're going to operationalize them. I'm putting a lot of focus on the annual report to the board. This is something that you spelled out quite clearly in your policy, that you wanted at least one formal visit from the LAC, and you wanted to focus on policy matters and particularly ends. So we're going to sort of focus some of the LAC's time on getting you a really good piece of feedback in an ownership mode on ends policies. And so we'll be working with Rose Mercier and others to help the council climb that hill and knock your socks off when the time comes. And then finally, with the Regional Transit Authority, we've continued to have, I think, really good working relationships and conversations with them. They sat down with the Watts Policy Committee once again, possibly for the last time this last week, to try to get input from elected officials across the county into the update to their regional transit plan. I confess the feedback is a bit mushy, maybe is a good word. I'm not sure it's really clear to all participants what the RTA is, what they're asking for, and we're not hearing a lot of really strong voices one way or the other, frankly. So the RTA, I really appreciate their efforts. They've had more feet on the ground here for Washtenaw County than they did in their previous election cycles. So I really appreciate the effort. At this point, I think they're actually going to begin the public elements of updating their plan before long. So don't feel surprised in the next couple of months if you start seeing things from the RTA about public input on transit's future in the region, web ads, TV ads, radio, things like that, or hearing chatter about it. Forrest and Ben at the RTA have been collaborating. We see a lot of opportunity to sort of nestle their product or their process in with ours, maybe even have some of the same joint meetings, just to make it easier for the public. So we look forward to having that continue. And then finally, the D2A2 service was mentioned a couple times in this meeting. We've had, this one's swinging back and forth, yes and no, on again, off again, still. Last time I spoke to the RTA about it, frankly, it didn't look good. Primarily because the largest market, 9 to 5 commuters, people going from Ann Arbor to Detroit or vice versa, were still prohibited from going to the office. And we all concluded that call on a somewhat pessimistic note. And then 2 days later, the governor announced, hey, I'm going to reopen offices. So, okay, game on. And we all started running back the other way. I know RTA staff will present some options to their board this month and possibly next month. But from my discussions with the RTA, their board still seems very uncertain. And there's a certain amount of reasonableness to that. So I don't know when the D2A2 service will get restarted. I do know that the closer we get to their election window, probably the less likely they're going to be to want to restart it. Now, their election window is November of 2022, and they may want to simply not have another variable to have to take into account when they're planning a millage campaign. So I still do hope that we'll be able to start the service again later this year. But if we can't get it started before fall, I think the chances begin to drop pretty quickly. But again, the final decision rests with the RTA. So, but we really do appreciate their efforts and that this has been on their radar screen and all the conversations with staff and board members that we've been having. So with that, Mr. Chair, I'm happy to see if there are any questions.
Any questions for Matt? Thank you, Matt. Okay, if there are no questions, then we'll move on to item 6, section 5, emergent business. Does anybody have any emergent business? If not, we'll go into closing item 6.1, topics for next meeting. Among other things, treatment of staff, policy 2.2. Anything else anybody wants to make sure we get on the agenda for next month? Then we've come to 6.2, public comment. So I'll go to Mr. Book. If you want to address the board again, you have 3 minutes. Please hit the raise hand icon, or if you're on the phone, hit *9. So I'll go over to Mr. Book. Do we have anybody who wants to address the board at this time?
Thank you, Chairman Mahler. Yes, we have Mr. Jim Mogensen. Mr. Mogensen, you've been unmuted.
All right. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So the first thing I wanted to bring up is it was very interesting, the discussion around ownership linkage. I mean, I think one of the challenges that the AATA has is that those things are incredibly complicated. And what I mean by that is that, for example, if you were to do a ridership survey, which is oftentimes done, there are people that are riding the bus that have driven on to the park and ride lots and do not live in a legal ownership, or, right, if you had those Venn diagrams, they're not part of the moral ownership that are part of the legal ownership, right? So they don't have to worry about the transit millage. They never had, that doesn't happen. So I bring that up as it gets incredibly complicated fast. The other thing is how people understand their, how they move what we'll call legal ownership. One is to elect different people. Another option would be to, and the ATA is like the Downtown Development Authority. People are appointed and you're theoretically not yourself. You are representing in some ways the city. And if the city says, we want to have all electric buses and you're not doing that, we need to have you disappointed if you're not doing that. See, this is very incredibly disruptive. If people don't like what the school board is doing, they can, elect different school board members, but they can't do that on either the DDA or the ATA. So I just kind of bring that up as part of the complexity. And I think it's important because you have just, as at the last meeting, you had your new policy about how to have where the capital money is. And I can envision a situation in which people come to this board and say, we want you to use that capital money that you've put aside and use it on electric buses. And the folks in Ypsilanti will just have to wait. And that's a terrifying challenge in terms of how those are going to work. And if people don't feel like they're being listened to, they vote down the millage, which simply creates chaos, most chaos in Ypsilanti and Ypsilanti Township. People are following that. So I just kind of bring that up as part of these complexities as you're trying to unpack this. And I think you'll get a whole lot more input over this next year than you have been experiencing in the past. Thank you very much for your time and attention and service serving on the board. Thank you.
Thank you. And Keith, do we have anybody else?
No, we don't have any other raised hands at this time.
All right, thank you. So we'll close the public comment period. And next is section 6.3 on the agenda to go into closed session for a briefing. So we need to make a motion to go into closed session pursuant to section 8H of the Open Meetings Act in order to discuss a written attorney-client privilege communication, which is material that is exempt from disclosure under state and federal law. So have somebody move that into the record. Mike, seconded by Kyra. Do a roll call vote then. I'll just go across my screen. Mike?
Yes.
Jesse?
Yes.
Kathleen?
Yes.
Kyra?
Yes.
Roger?
Yes.
Rich?
Yes.
Raymond?
Yes.
And I'm also a yes. So I think that's everybody. I didn't miss anybody, did I? Okay. I think the link to get into the closed section was sent out Monday afternoon around 3:30 by Keith. So please click on that link and I'll see you in the closed session. Please leave this meeting and go into that one.